All right. How's everybody doing? Welcome to the Real Crusades History live stream. So my name is J. Stephen Roberts. I am joined by my good friend Rand Brown. How you doing, Rand?
Good.
All right.
Everybody.
Absolutely. And Scott Amos is with us as well. Scott, how are you doing?
I'm doing fine, Stephen, and glad we haven't done one of these in a long time. Glad we're starting again. So thanks for inviting me.
Absolutely. Good to have both of you as always. So this is going to be an interesting stream, I think. This is the topic, as everybody can see, is the Albigensian Crusade. My idea, though, was not to do a chronology of the events or anything like that. In fact, I'm actually doing a video series about the Albigensian Crusade right now, which will be covering that sort of thing. It covers just the chronological events of the Crusade itself. This is meant to be a little discussion of some of the issues that the Albigensian Crusade raises. And I think there's quite a bit to discuss here. The Albigensian Crusade is a weird moment in the history of the Crusades, in my opinion. I know not everybody agrees with that. Some people think it makes absolute sense, that there's nothing strange about it. I think it kind of represents the Crusades movement at a crossroads, and it kind of is a point at which the Pope and the Church, like I guess we could say Pope Innocent, really takes the Crusades in a very specific direction that he might have not elected to do. If you know, he could have gone a different way, I guess is what I'm saying. But I think that has some long-term consequences for the Crusades movement and for the and for the church. So I guess we should ask if the audio is sounding okay to everybody out there in the chat. If you guys can throw up a little comment. How about this? Press 1 if everything is sounding good to you in the chat.
I just told them all to make some noise. So
people are just saying that it sounds fine. Come on, guys. Hit 1. Okay, I'm seeing a 1. Okay, right. There's a 100. Very good. All right, we appreciate that, gentlemen and ladies. If there are any ladies out there, I know this tends to be a heavily male Real Crusades histories. If Google's analytics are to be believed, we are 90% male audience, 10% female Crusade nerds out there.
Damn.
As well. So boys, if you're looking for a Crusader bride, there are a few to be had. Okay. So anyway, does everybody have the notes up in front of them for our little discussion here?
Yep.
Yes.
Okay. So kind of my idea, and you guys can tell me if you like this, and of course this is casual, we can take it in any direction we want to, but I thought we could hit some of these specific major players in the Albigensian Crusade. Because one thing I think it's great about the Albigensian Crusade is, we got one young fair lady representing in the chat there. One thing that's great about, yeah, good for her. One thing that's great about the Albigensian Crusade is that there is, each of the parties involved bring so much tension, and there really are some issues that have to be hashed out, and it's not always that clear. So let's start off with the Cathars themselves.
Oh, I think Paul joined us.
Oh, really? Paul, are you?
There he is.
Paul, how are we doing? He's got himself
muted.
He's muted himself right now.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. But when Paul gets in here, we'll talk to him. But so the Cathars, one thing I was thinking about, and I guess I'll do a quick introduction here just in case. I mean, surely everybody who's on this knows what we're talking about. But the Albigensian Crusade, it gets going at the start of the 13th century. What's going on is that in the region that is now the south of France, the Languedoc, especially, we're talking about the county of Toulouse and some of its dependencies. This is a region where a particular heresy has begun to take root and is in fact flourishing in some respect. And we'll talk about why that is, but Catharism. The church was unhappy about this, and we'll talk about that as well, because that's quite interesting. This is a time when heresy represents treason, essentially, in society. And the church takes steps to try to eliminate this heresy with preaching and a campaign of sending papal legates to the area. Pope Innocent III is the pope at this time. He's a very important pope in history, perhaps the most powerful pope to ever sit on the throne of St. Peter, if we're talking about political power. But Pope Innocent's missionary effort, if you will, fails. Heresy continues to flourish. And the Pope decides that the time is right to call a crusade to the Languedoc. This is how he's going to try to eliminate this heresy. Okay, so the Cathars. So what is this heresy that's going on in the region that's causing so many problems? So who wants to give a little summary of Catharism?
I can do that.
Okay, go ahead, Scott. Yeah.
Well, the Cathars are they had they're a dualistic sect. They do not believe in the Trinity. They were more akin to the Gnostic sects of the early centuries after Christ. They were mystics. They in varying degrees, they were akin to the Gnostics, Manichaeus, Donatists, and the later manifestations was the Bogomils. But they were all based in dualistic theologies that rejected Orthodox Christian positions such as the virgin birth, the Trinity, and the actual physical existence of Jesus Christ. And according to their teachings, I guess it's simply a good God created the spiritual world, and an evil God or the devil created the material world. And the object of their spiritual practice was to break the bonds between the spiritual and material, which was also an object of Orthodox practice, but they just went about it in a different, radically different in what you would call it. And it was also, well, I have to say again that Catharism is also similar to the Buddhist and Vedic teachings of India, notably in the areas of belief in reincarnation and the austere spiritual practices undertaken by the Cathar perfects. So anyway, they rejected they were Christians. They believed in the divinity of Christ, but they just rejected just about every church position and every church doctrine.
Well, they really weren't Christian in any sense. They were
well, I mean,
something totally different.
They believed in the divinity of Jesus Christ. So I guess that's.
I would say they were Christian in so much as they were as in their trappings, but really fundamentally, when it came to the core Christian tenet doctrines, they were not Christian. They you could almost compare them to sort of later cultic movements that would spring up. They were sort of maybe almost kind of the Mormons. Kind of very very similar to them, where there's some very very fundamental doctrinal differences between them and what would be considered authentic Christianity. And
that's why I said they reminded me as they're so much. They have a lot of similarity to the Buddhists and the Hindus in their teachings.
Yeah, exactly. There were other elements that would almost be considered pagan by medieval standards.
So basically, I think, just to kind of summarize it, the Cathars were dualists, and they believed in an evil material God and a good spiritual God. And yeah, they certainly rejected the idea of salvation, like Christ. Christ didn't save you from sin. In fact, it's this process of the consolamentum that is what liberates you from the physical world, which is kind of sin itself. So this is and I think one of the important things too is their beliefs were kind of fall into this category of being antisocial, I think you might almost say. They rejected family life. They had this very negative view of procreation. So childbirth is evil because it's trapping souls in physical matter. They had a very negative view of the female body, and they were kind of anti-female in a lot of ways, which is interesting because they have this reputation now for being almost proto-feminists among sort of modern people who misunderstand them. But they really, because of their hatred of childbirth, they took a pretty negative view of femininity. And for both men and women, of course, the idea is to transcend your very physical essence. So, your sexuality there's no sex. They did not eat meat because that meat is the product of, physical procreation. So anyway, it's interesting. I mean,
they were very, very, very bizarre for the medieval world, for the medieval Christian world. They were, and there's an element where when you read accounts, especially like legal documents and documents that are left to us from like the Dominicans and the other church officials who actually went in to engage these people, head on. There is sort of a kind of a bafflement that comes across. It's sort of like wow, where did these people come from? Where did they get this? It's almost just kind of bizarre. Just you can tell that some of the people from Christendom that came in to actually engage with them and engage in dialogue, they sort of weren't sure what to do with them. It was unlike anything they'd ever seen before, or at least in a very long time. So
now we have a comment from somebody in the chat. I think it's actually very to the point here. Brunetix says the problem is they were spreading heresy to people who were not educated enough to distinguish it as heresy, making them fall in hell. Now, it's one thing I think we do need to point out here, because nowadays there's this idea, like, people look at the Albigensian Crusade, the whole thing, they just say, well, this is just intolerance, because that's our modern moral system. The reality is that for the church at this time, indeed for Christian society at this time, a heretic was especially one who's out there preaching heresy, is someone who is leading people to hell, so destroying people.
Well, I think something needs to be said, like right at the beginning of this conversation, is that and this is for the benefit of all our listeners, and I'm sure they've heard this a million times before from us, but in order to really fully historically appreciate the situation and to understand the complexities behind it, you have to leave your secular postmodern. Essentially, you have to leave your secular postmodern blinders behind. You will not understand it if you don't, because we don't live in that kind of a world anymore. People don't realize that the faith, that the practice of the faith, even for medieval Christians, for medieval Catholics, was the faith was not some abstract, purely personal affair that just suited your spiritual taste, and you left it out of everything else in your life. The faith was a very tangible, it was a very real thing, and the laws that accompanied the faith, the laws of doctrine, the moral law, the divine laws that accompanied it were very, very real to the medievals. Real in a way that probably the best way, one of our favorite guest academics who comes on every now and then, Dr. Latham, said it best. The medievals looked at the laws of doctrine the way we look at the laws of physics today. They were just unquestionable realities of our cosmos. Like you didn't, if you question them, it was sort of like, well, what's wrong with you? You know, you didn't. There wasn't the subjectivity. There wasn't the subjectivity that we now have today with our, you know, with modern secularism. And that, so in order, before we even begin talking about the Albigensian Crusade and the motives of people on either side, you have to enter it with that understanding that to the medieval Catholic, to the medieval Christian, the religious reality was reality, and it was a very tangible reality. It was a very real thing to them that just to question it was almost it sort of beggared belief.
Basically, Cathars would have been like people who would have the way we would think of people going around destroying, killing people, you know, destroying property, whatever. I mean, this was like the bad of the bad, and the idea was that this had to be dealt with. So
in official French legal documents from the time, especially from like the reign of King St. Louis IX, who he actually did quite a bit in the aftermath of the Albigensian Crusade to sort of rehabilitate the Languedoc. But in French legal documents from the time, they refer to heretics. The French legal term for heretic and for basically like brigand was the same word. It was
right. It was treason.
It was like that was the same thing to them. It wasn't, oh, they just believe differently than us, and so we're going to be intolerant and we're going to crush them. No. They actually saw them as, no, these people are a threat to the very fabric of society, to the very fabric of in the terms of St. Augustine, of the tranquility of order, and therefore the state or what, you know, what existed at that time, because even the concept of the state was different than what we know now. But the secular rulers of the time had not only a right, but they had a duty to act upon this.
Yeah. The way it's Thomas, you know, reading out of just Thomas Madden's New Concise History, it expresses all that pretty well. It says, in the medieval world, heresy did not represent benign religious diversity. Far from it. It was seen as an insidious and cancerous threat to the well-being of Christendom and the salvation of the faithful.
Yeah.
Christ's admonition to St. Peter bound his successors, feed my sheep. But anyway, it ends up by saying, because it threatened the body of Christ from within, heresy was held to be far more dangerous than faraway Muslims.
Yeah, and we'll get into that in a little bit here. But the last thing I want to say about the Cathars is that there's a lot of question, I think, about how many there really were. Tyerman says that there were probably between 1,000 and 1,500 perfects in Languedoc. Now, of course, perfects are kind of the Cathar priests. These are Cathars who have gone through the ceremony of consolamentum. And so basically they have renounced all worldly attachments. They barely eat anything at all. Of course, they don't have sex. They kind of live almost like this razor thin existence, close to death, really. And they can administer the consolamentum ritual on other Cathars.
Sort of like a much more intense version of like the Stoics from classical times.
So I guess the point is we don't really know exactly maybe that there were that many perfects. We don't know how many actual Cathars there were, like the believers who had not yet taken the Consolamentum. They made up by far the majority. Some estimates are that perhaps as much as 10% of the population of the Languedoc was believing Cathars. But of course, they were kind of living outside the bounds of normal society, outside the bounds of accepted behavior, and so a lot of them were secretive. I know I read one account about there was some bishop who, upon his death, when they were preparing his body, they found that he had something on his body that indicated he was a Cathar. So it's like nobody knew, There were Cathars in all the noble families, apparently, or at least a lot of the. I guess what I should say is a lot of the major nobles had Cathars in their families, oftentimes female members of their family. Okay, so the church. So if we talk about Pope Innocent III and the way he's looking at this whole thing, I guess there's a couple things we can say. First of all, Pope Innocent is presiding over a new phase in the church. Like we said earlier, he is the most politically powerful pope in history. And I think it's interesting, we see how much things have changed from the days of Pope Urban II. Pope Urban II was a pope on the run, preaching the First Crusade, kind of innovating this new thing. It's a little over 100 years later. The Crusades are now an institution. They are one of the central facets of Christendom. And Pope Innocent makes crusading one of the central features of his papacy. He's organizing crusades in Spain, in the Baltic, in the Holy Land, and of course this Albigensian thing gets going under him. Do any of you guys have any comments about the Pope's perspective on all this?
Well, the Pope, probably more so than anyone else in Christendom at the time, really, Innocent III was the product of. He was the product of the final victory of the investiture crisis. He was the Pope when the papacy really came into its own in the medieval world, and really was the unquestioned moral authority for all of Christendom.
And he kind of had a political authority too. Like he
absolutely did. He absolutely did. But again, you got to remember, in the medieval world, at least in the West, and pretty much for everywhere else, but very much in Christendom, those two concepts were not mutually exclusive, like what we think of. The political power and spiritual power back then kind of went hand in hand, not in a ham-fisted, forced way like a modern day theocracy, but in kind of a more synergistic manner, in which medievals didn't think in terms of secular and religious. Those categories didn't exist to them. Everything was all intertwined and it was all interconnected. So if you have a pope who, he's the product of the final victory of the investiture crisis of the victory of Pope over Emperor, then that is going to have massive political repercussions across Christendom as well. And that's what you see in Innocent III. Innocent III was, they call him the most powerful, when the papacy was at its height in terms of temporal power, and it's because back in that day they didn't really differentiate the two. So he more so than anyone else in Christendom would have had this mentality, the Augustinian mentality of the tranquility of order, and heretics, especially a heresy as I guess if you could call it a heresy as fundamental as the Cathars were, is a major threat to just the social order. They're a major threat to that tranquility of order that it is their duty to maintain. And what's worse is that this is springing up not on the fringe frontiers of Christendom, like out in the Levant or out in the Baltic or somewhere else, But this is like in the heart of Christendom. This is in France. This is in southern France. You had, this is from a region where some of the most famous crusaders came from. This is to them. This is to Innocent III. This is a major once in a lifetime crisis that is facing the church, and that's the way he would have looked at it.
Yeah, I think that oftentimes these days, and I'm going to refer to kind of the way pop culture sort of looks at this whole thing. Innocence and the church's role in this whole thing is dismissed as this is about power. They were just trying to maintain their power. I don't know if you guys should look up like some of these modern people who kind of think that they're going back and becoming Cathars are really funny. Like. Because they kind of just project all of the present day world, the sort of modern, sort of a modern PC attitude onto the Cathars, and just think that that's who they were, and they were standing up to this mean, intolerant pope or something. But the Cathars themselves were just as quote unquote intolerant as the Orthodox Church, if you want to say. They just weren't in power.
You get kind of the feeling that from some of the reading, like you're saying, some of those types of sources, Stephen, that there were these kind of Christian hippies or something like from the 70s or 60s.
It's funny whenever you see them like portrayed in film, like they kind of sort of almost did it in that television series that I just will refuse to name, but everybody knows what I'm talking about. Even when they portrayed sort of, someone who was sort of like the Cathars, he was like this, this long-haired, dope smoking hippie, like living in the
Which the truth is that is not how they were.
No, with his animal bones and his, it's just like, what? No, that's not what they were at all. That's in fact they were kind of frighteningly aesthetic, and they were like very disturbingly so. And they were obsessed with cleanliness, and they kind of had this very it's all sprang from their obsessive dualist doctrine, but they had this really bad attitude towards anything physical, anything material, anything sensual. They were not the hippies of the medieval world. Let's just put it that way.
Well, now you're speaking of the perfects, though, right, Rand? Because from what I understand, there was just a whole spectrum of belief and practice, and in the Cathar universe. It went everywhere from the perfects down to people who just were kind of hangers on, and they figured they'd take the consolamentum, before they died. It was that kind of thing, but they lived just regular lives. Whatever that meant to them. It was the perfects who were, and there really weren't that many of them. I don't know. That's something that I've wondered, how there were so few perfects, but there were a lot of people who are adherents out there, but the range of their behavior and belief is kind of open to question. Am I correct on that? Or
it would be. It would be, and that's one of the things when you read like the legal documents from like the French Inquisitions and the Dominican Inquisitions that followed in the aftermath of the Albigensian Crusade. You really get the number of people who were pulled into ecclesiastical inquests and were basically like cleared with nothing more than just sort of like a wrist slap were a lot. In fact, the vast majority of them were because they realized that, and in fact they were especially lenient on women. Believe it or not, actually, women fediti were generally dealt with a lot more leniency, because in their mind, a lot of times the only reason a woman identified herself with the heresy was because her husband had. And so to them, it was sort of like, well, it's not really her fault, she was just sort of going along with whatever her husband wanted. And oh, by the way, her husband was killed in the fighting, way back when. So, she doesn't seem too enthusiastic about it now. So, what are we going to do? And most of the time it was like, well, hey, make a profession of faith, have a confession, receive absolution. And that was kind of about it. It really wasn't, it really was not this, there were very, very, very few Cathars who were actually willing to die for this belief set. In fact, shockingly few were actually willing to die for it.
Yeah, and we've had a couple people in the chat already kind of like bring up the G word and stuff and say that this is just oh, you guys are trying to explain away that what the church did. What we're really trying to do here is get a clear understanding of all perspectives here. The Cathars had their perspective, the church had their perspective, and I think I kind of actually want to move on from the Cathars and the church right now, because I know we've kind of gone over that quite a bit, but okay. So actually, Jinsel just brought up Raymond VI of Toulouse. So I think that's one thing we should bring up here: the nobility in the Languedoc. Because, okay, so Raymond VI of Toulouse, he's the most powerful noble in the region. And as we talked about, he's the descendant of one of the most famous first crusaders, Raymond IV of Toulouse. Okay, so what is the Pope's real complaint against the rulers of the Languedoc, like Raymond VI? His complaint is not that they are themselves heretics. His complaint is that they are not doing their job as secular rulers in maintaining orthodoxy of the faith. They are allowing a heresy to flourish. And it's interesting because the response that somebody like Raymond VI of Toulouse gives to the Pope is, look, I can't do what you're asking me to do. And even if I wanted to, it's interesting. We don't really know exactly what Raymond VI wanted. I think, we could say that ultimately he wanted to be rid of the Pope and, bothering him about this. I think it's clear that he wanted to maintain his position. Who wouldn't? This is his inheritance as a nobleman. And that's one thing we're going to see a lot in the Albigensian Crusade. The nobility of the Languedoc viewed this whole thing as an attack on their right, their right as the nobility of the region to have dominion in this area. They view the whole thing as an imposition on them.
And I would actually argue it went even deeper than that. And this is one of the biggest things that I find possibly one of the most key topics to understanding the Albigensian Crusade and why it went down the way it did, was because you really have to understand the cultural differences that were at play within France at this time. The Languedoc, which was predominantly composed of Toulouse, Provence, and Gascony, which is all of southern France, all of what today we would think of as the Riviera. This area of France was always very culturally and even at that time ethnically distinct from the rest of France, particularly northern and eastern France, the more Frankish parts of France. What you really saw at play with the Albigensian Crusade was it was really sort of a clash of cultures between the southern Visigoth, the remnants of southern Visigothic France and northern Frankish France. This was, they even had different languages. They had a different language. They were separated by language. They were separated by culture. They were separated by centuries of these very, very deep differences that defined one another. And the Languedoc developed a different tradition than the rest of France. They developed a tradition that was very independent, sometimes ferociously independent. They very much valued that independence. They did not want to be a part, or even if they begrudgingly wanted to be a part of it. It was begrudging, but they weren't super enthusiastic of being a part of this sort of idea of greater France. You got to remember, this is before the advent of the nation state and modern concepts like that. So they really were just a very ferociously independent bunch, and they really the idea of the papacy utilizing the northern French culture to sort of impose itself upon them was it just really rankled them in places that they just, it was just intolerable to them. They couldn't stand that idea of, the rest of France was going to sort of come in and impose itself on them for whatever reason. And it was. So what the reaction you're seeing in Raymond VI is that reaction. It's that okay, look, I like to compare the relationship between the Southern French leadership and the Cathars in the same way that for maybe a modern American audience, it was sort of similar to, think of like very deep conservative rural Texas with the Branch Davidian cult. They may be weirdos, but they're all weirdos.
Yeah.
And think of the Northern French, Simone de Montfort, and the Albigensian Crusaders coming in at the behest of the papacy. Think of them as like Janet Reno and the ATF. It's like oh no. These are our weirdos. We'll take care of them. You stay the hell out.
And I don't think we can say that there was no sympathy for Catharism among the nobility.
Absolutely.
I'm not saying you said that, Rand. But Tyerman has a good quote. It's like some exchange between the Bishop of Toulouse and one of the local nobles he was talking to. And he was asking him, why don't you get rid of these people? And he said, well, look, some of them are our relatives. And, we've grown up around a lot of them. And exactly. we think that, and a lot of us can see the good in their lifestyle. Yeah. So,
and the last thing they want to see is, tanks coming in at the behest of Janet Reno and burning down a compound with, full of a bunch of kids. Like, that was kind of the attitude. It was sort of like, hey, look, okay, we don't maybe agree with everything these people say. Maybe, yeah, okay, fine. Maybe they're kind of weird. Maybe they make the Pope a little uneasy, with the way they are. But look, these are our people. Like, they may be weirdos, but they're our weirdos. And we don't need you all coming in here telling us how it's going to be. And I think that's why you see the ferocious resistance that they put up when the crusade actually gets underway. It had way more to do with sort of a very deep-rooted cultural and linguistic and ethnic differences, coupled with a very ferocious independence. I think this guy, John Reddick, he's actually one of our favorites on the Facebook group. He says the Cathars looked good because of their emphasis on purity and sort of a poverty of living. And that is a good point, because the 13th century was also a time of incredible wealth, and the Latin West was going through a period of really becoming very wealthy, and trade was flourishing. They were now dominating a big part of the Mediterranean. And this was kind of creating a bit of a spiritual backlash. I mean, the Franciscans, St. Francis kind of rejected that in favor of poverty. And the Cathars were all, maybe we could even consider them a little component of that. But in fact, I would argue they very much were. That there was a movement within Christendom at that time towards a sort of asceticism that manifested itself in several Orthodox ways, and primarily, you mentioned one of them, the Franciscans, and then there was the other mendicant order, the Dominicans, that sprung up at that time. So that was very much a movement. It was just it was an aberrant movement. It was one that went way too far off into territories that were just way outside of orthodoxy, and kind of veered off into Never Never Land. But really the cultural aspect of this conflict cannot be left out of the discussion, because honestly, I think it's one of the most important features to really understanding why it happened the way it did.
Yeah, I think on one hand there was the religious aspect, the struggle between Catharism and the Orthodox Christian Church, and then there was the Orthodox Catholic Church, and then there was the struggle between the Southern and Northern nobility. So there was a power struggle at play as well. Hey, it looks like Paul is in here. Paul, can you hear me?
I sure can. Can you hear me?
Oh, so what? You just been hanging out there like a creeper, like not saying anything? Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I've been here.
Paul, I don't know if you can hear me or not.
Yeah, I can hear you. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
I can hear you just fine, Paul.
Great.
Well, I can't hear Paul, so oh man. So Paul is talking right now.
Yeah, I mean, you can just assume everything that I'm saying is right and just nod and smile and agree with it.
I can't hear Paul at all. Everybody else can hear Paul.
That's okay. Just real quick for our listeners on YouTube, can everyone hear Paul Copenhagen when he says anything? Let us know, please.
Press 1 if you can hear Paul.
God, not this again.
Paul sent me a message. He said, "You can assume everything I say is right."
Yep.
Okay.
They can all hear him.
Okay,
so.
They can all hear him. Perfect. Well, I'll tell you what. I want to let Paul talk because he's got some great thoughts. Paul, let's move on to Simon of Montfort and the French nobles who were kind of coming in what happens is the Pope needs somebody to take control of these lands that he thinks aren't being properly governed by Raymond of Toulouse and the nobility of the Languedoc. So, Paul, Simon of Montfort and the French, let's just say Simon of Montfort, piety married with territorial ambition.
Oh, absolutely.
And did he overstep his bounds? What do you think? I'll let him talk.
Yeah, absolutely. Simon of Montfort is a pious character. I mean, he's one of the great leaders of the Crusades in this area, and he marries his ambitions, his political ambitions, to piety, just like you said. But they do get away from him. So I'd like to backtrack a little bit and kind of. I think the two main players here are Raymond VI and Simone de Montfort. And I think you can make a very good contrast between the two. On the one side, you have the Cathar Raymond VI. On the other side, you have the Catholic Simone de Montfort. One is a consummate warrior. He is devoted entirely to his military aspirations. And then on the other side, Raymond VI, he enjoyed more of a social reputation. He was certainly no slouch when it came to military endeavors, but that's not what he was all about. He was very much geared toward, enjoying his life and the social aspects of it. That's very much Raymond. And the part of what leads to this problem is actually the death of one of the papal ambassadors. It's a papal legate. The Pope sends a legate out to basically confront Raymond about this, and on his way back, he's assassinated, and that's when Raymond is excommunicated. Raymond humbles himself before the Pope, which is, of course, a very humiliating thing to do to anybody. The Holy Roman Emperor had done it at Canossa. I mean, this is something it's not just a matter of writing a letter and going into a confessional and saying, "Oh, I'm sorry, I'll say 5 Hail Marys and I'll go my merry way." I mean, this was very much you know a theatrical humbling, and it was a very public affair. He had to be humbled before the Pope, and that just further rankled Raymond VI. So when it comes to a head, and we're talking about the actual fighting, the actual crusade, we wind up with Simon as coming forward as one of the great leaders from the north, and he's tapped both because of his expertise as well as his loyalty. Uh, and it comes to a head actually at the siege of Toulouse. That's where Simon dies. He oversteps himself because it is at least uh, uh, you know it, he's the one who's leading the siege. I think the great quote that comes out of this is "Kill them all, God will know His own." Because, as you mentioned before, the Cathars are certainly a minority, a distinct minority, but a minority nonetheless. So when this whole town being is being put to siege, and they're saying, how are we supposed to tell the Cathars from the Catholics? How do we figure this one out? He's just saying, it doesn't matter, just kill them all, because at least the faithful inside the walls will be saved. They will go to heaven, and that doesn't matter. That's a good thing. So it really, like, he saw absolutely no reason to hold back, which is a very, very um, unique view for this time period, because this is the time period, of course, of taking people for ransom, holding people as captive, uh, you know, paying large amounts of ransom, even for the populations of cities. We saw that well in the Levant, between Saladin and his other and Richard, Balian of Ebelin, um, and all of the rest. So the fact that it doesn't play out here at home kind of speaks to Simone's general savagery when it comes to executing this campaign. And I think that he parts with the piety aspect of it, and he's just looking to topple one of the great rivals that he would have in the South. Um, we also have to remember at this time that the French monarchy is not the most powerful. um, many of these territories also still swear some measure of loyalty to the English crown. So there's a lot of political, not just within France, not just between the northern French and the southern French. There's a lot of political and cultural tension as well between the English and the French. Um, Simon of Montfort, is also the fifth Earl of Leicester. He is an English noble with French holdings. Um, you know, so it's one of those things where he represents not just a Northern English person, but a foreign invader as well. And so he knows that if he's going to be if he's going to be ruling this area, this very large chunk of land, that which he hopes to obviously maintain control over well after this whole crusade is ended, he needs the population to basically not give him trouble. And this is before the age of trying to win hearts and minds, and win everybody to your side, and investing in the populace, things like that we have now. A measure of brutality is really what was the order of the day. You put fear into the hearts of the population. You get them to surrender, so that they don't think to rise up against you, because hey, this is something that is going to happen. Like, you butcher these people now, and then the survivors will remember it for generations to come, and they will, anytime somebody starts saying, well, maybe we should revolt against this guy, the rest of them that actually remember what happened will say, no, sit down and shut up and get back to work. So that provides a sort of incentive for that sort of peaceful occupation in the aftermath. Um, and he really did try to uh, confiscate this land, and let his he really did let his ambition get the better of him.
Well, Paul, you touched on something that was really important back there, and one of them was you're absolutely right. Not only was there this conflict between northern and southern France. Even within southern France, you had multiple different. Southern France really was a very in the early to mid 1200s was a very cosmopolitan place. It was kind of a crossroads of sorts for Europe, and you had the Gascons, who were very intimately connected to the English crown with the Angevin Empire and Henry II. You had Toulouse that had cross-border, very deep cross-border connections with the Kingdom of Aragon, the Spanish Kingdom of Aragon, which we will discuss later on in this. Hopefully, I'm not spoiling things too much. So there was very much there was a lot of just very powerful cultural ties that were pulling in all sorts of different directions. One thing I would like to say, and it's something that's always fascinated me that you really don't hear much about, is you don't hear a whole lot about Catharism in the English possessions in Aquitaine. You don't really hear a whole lot about them. In fact, you almost wonder if there were any at all. I'm not sure. I've never. And the extreme Western Languedoc does not seem to have been influenced by the Cathar heresy as much as Toulouse and Provence were. But I think it'd be a fascinating thing to investigate if I ever had the time or the money to do that. But I think the other thing that would be important to mention is that Simone de Montfort. I think also maybe I don't think it'd be unfair to say that he sort of saw himself as the man of the moment.
Absolutely.
This was an individual who I think kind of saw that his destiny had arrived, and this was his chance to really put himself forward in a lot of ways, both temporally and spiritually. Again, I shy away from injecting too much, and I'm not saying you were at all, but I shy away from the postmodern secularist instinct of sort of injecting our own innate, what's the word I'm looking for, cynicism on him. I don't think he was some. I think he actually did very much believe in what he was doing. It's just like like we discussed earlier. At that time, medievals didn't think in terms of spiritual and temporal as mutually exclusive affairs. This was a guy who was literally approached by the King of France, possibly one of the most powerful, foremost rulers of Europe, and the Pope, the supreme moral authority of Christendom, and was like, "Hey, can you help us sort this situation out?" And I think anybody in that day and age would have been like, "Yes, I don't even know what I'm doing, but yes, I'm your guy. Like, I can do this."
And I agree completely. He really is that man in the moment. You mentioned the lack of Catharism in Bordeaux and Aquitaine, and one of the things that has always kind of um, I just would like to kind of theorize with you and kind of throw this out there just as a little prospect, as a little possibility. The Languedoc region, I mean, it gets its name from the language of Occitan,
Yep.
which is a kind of mishmash between French and then the Basque languages that come out of
Yeah.
northern
As
Spain.
somebody once described, because I believe it or not, I actually spent my honeymoon in that
Yep.
area. And as someone there described it to me once, it's a Pyrenees language.
Yeah, it is. It really is. And the Basques are kind of an other, like they're treated as this other sort of group in Spain. They're really not welcome anywhere they go, and they do have some rather odd tendencies. And they have some real problems wherever they kind of wind up. And part of where they wind up is in the Occitan region in France. But I'm not sure that they really ever settled in Aquitaine, or moved into the Bordeaux or Bayonne, anywhere around
Yeah,
there.
yeah.
So I wonder if there's like a
You don't hear about Catharism in English France.
yeah.
You
And
really just don't.
I wonder if that's why, because the culture of English France was so that merging between England
Yeah,
and France, English and French, and then the Basques kind of moved into this other
yeah.
area of the
I
Riviera.
kind of feel like even if there was, because you have to think that there had to have been somebody who probably went in that direction. There had to have been some Cathar prefects, maybe a little more enthusiastic than the rest, who went towards that direction. But I would think, because of just the inherent precariousness of the English possessions in France, I think they probably were like, it was sort of one of those. Nope, they're not here. No,
Yeah,
we're good.
yeah,
Like, like, no Cathars here. We looked. Nope, we don't see any. So we're good.
yeah, yeah. I wonder if that's the case.
And they
You know,
may have taken steps on their own to sort of nip it in the bud, and just kind
yep.
of quash it, and sort of like, nope, not here. No, you're
And
not.
the other part is that, remember who's ruling England at this time. This is a
Yes.
man, King John of England is in charge of England. And he's already got problems with the church.
Yes.
So I don't know that there. I think if the Pope were to look at England at this time and look at all of these possessions and look at all of Christendom, what he's really having the problem with, he's not going to have a problem. It's not going to be top priority if England, who is already a problem and a thorn in his side
Yes.
under King John, has other problems going on. The
Yes.
problem is the eldest daughter of Christendom, France, the bosom
Yes.
of the Pope. I mean, this is his pride and joy. This is
Yep.
Christendom's pride and joy, right outside of Rome itself.
Yeah, I think there
where
very
it
much
is.
was. I think there very much was a notion that if France, if the faith in France fails, Christendom fails.
Yes.
And Pope Innocent III, when he met Saint Francis in Rome, and he communicated to him about the need for the mendicant orders to go out and combat heresy and things like that, he kind of alluded to that. If you read the account of their meeting, he very much sort of was like, hey, if France is having these problems, we got problems, and this is a big deal. So no, I would totally agree with you on that.
Real quick, I want to just jump on what you guys are talking about here with the idea that this cannot. If this is happening here, this is going to lead to bad consequences for Christendom as a whole. And I think, as the idea too, is the Crusades movement itself. Like, one of the things that Innocent III talked about is that we are not going to have successful Crusades on the frontier if we have this heresy eating away at Christendom internally. And I think that that kind of brings up the whole issue of, should the Crusades be used internally? Like, is that an appropriate use of the Crusades? Pope Innocent, I mean, the interesting thing about it is Pope Innocent seems to not have any doubt whatsoever about that. But one of the questions I think that really comes up with the Albigensian Crusade is the church's ability to control the Crusades movement, like, because the church has to rely so much on, okay, Pope Innocent can preach a crusade, but then the nobility and the knights have to fight it. And the problem that seems to come up with the Albigensian Crusade, kind of like with the Fourth Crusade, is that the Pope has this plan, he lays it out, he puts it in motion, but then things don't necessarily go the way he wants them to. And I think we can all agree that there are some things that happen in the Albigensian Crusade that are just absolutely horrific. I mean, like the siege of Bezier, for example.
Yep.
And it's like, and certainly, whatever you think about, Catharism or whatever, there were, regular Orthodox Catholics who suffered horribly because of the Albigensian Crusade. So it's kind of a weird moment we're in. It's like the Crusades were started in at the end of the 11th century as a vehicle to protect Christians. I mean, that's what Pope Urban II talked about. He talked about, go help your fellow Christians in the East. And now suddenly we have a situation where crusaders are engaging in activity that is harming, Orthodox Christians right there in the Languedoc, in the heart of Christendom. So it's like, on the one hand, the heart of it's like, well, we have to take this seriously because it's right in the heart of Christendom. But on the other hand, doing that creates a situation where Christians are being harmed. So that's what. So I really do think that the Albigensian Crusade brings up all these issues. And I think one of the really most interesting issues is, to what extent can Pope Innocent's vision really be brought to fruition, because he has to rely on somebody like Simone of Montfort? What do you guys think?
I think that Innocent III, you mentioned it, that Innocent III can preach the crusade, but these people, the knights, the lords like Simon, they have to fight it. And as you mentioned, when it comes to like the sack of Zara, for example, in the Fourth Crusade, the Pope very clearly condemns this, excommunicates the crusade, and then says, now get your butts over to the Holy Land and do what you're supposed to do. And then I mean, it's a debacle. um I don't I think that Innocent III liked the thought of using the crusades to handle the real enemies of the church, but I don't think he understood the mechanisms of control well enough. And I think that there was, whereas when you're far away from home, there's a certain level of respect that you have to have for what you're doing, why you're going over there. And this is part of what undercuts the myth that the early crusades, the first crusade, for example, was just a bunch of second sons and landless nobles that went over to conquer land for themselves. That's absolutely a farce. And the reason that it is that farce is because these men were men of deep faith. They had this belief that what they were doing was what was right and good and true. And they did that out of that belief, out of that moral superiority, that moral assurance. Okay. Um, and when you're fighting somebody else, there is that moral assurance there. You can kind of separate psychologically, I think, people into that moral surety of yourself. And in that black and white moral surety, there's definite sides to things. But when you're dealing with a town like Beziers or Toulouse, and you've got people wandering the streets, mounting the battlements, fighting against you, who are your co-religionists, that's really the wrong place to be using the crusade. And I think that's one of the reasons. And I don't think that Innocent III really quite fully understood that. And I think that's the reason that that it goes so awry. And that's something that is a real problem with it. And this was something that he had learned previously when the Fourth Crusade, goes after the Eastern Orthodox Christians. He's like, hey, I mean, he absolutely condemns going after Zara and going after Constantinople until it's too late, until there's nothing more that he can do. And then here we see in southern France, and he's like, okay, look, this is something that he needs to have a more military arm taking control to uh, really establish the groundwork. And I think what Innocent III was hoping was he goes in, there's a quick campaign, they take control over southern France, and then they lay the groundwork for the mendicant orders to do their thing and to fight that heresy, to wipe out Catharism. Okay.
Hmm.
And I think that is probably what Innocent III's mindset was, is hey, we can kind of learn from the negatives of what happened in the Fourth Crusade, and we can do this better.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, being that the people that he's asking are so close to home, that with Simon, I mean, you get this problem of the war leader winds up being awarded the lands of Raymond VI. I mean, there's a real sort of profit motive, and it can corrupt anything, even as something as pure as taking good care of these people and wanting to stamp out this heresy and wanting to care for uh
Mhm.
and be proper caretakers of this medieval southern France. Wanting to do that can be undermined by that pure profit and power.
Yeah.
um
Well, I think, Paul, you also kind of touch on something that's even maybe a little more, for lack of a better term, delicate, or maybe not quite as perceptible. But I loved how you talk about how Innocent the Third, maybe from everything we know, had the best of intentions, had a very noble reason for deciding what he did. It's just everybody involved, Innocent III, Simone de Montfort, King, who was the king of France at the time? It was Louis the Ninth's father.
First it was Philip II, and
Yeah, it was
then
Philip
and then it was
very
Louis VIII.
Louis VIII, thank you. So Louis VIII, Raymond VI, King Pedro of Aragon, all these people who got involved. It sort of really just kind of developed into what they call the Thucydides trap. And I highly recommend this. And that's the title of a book that I highly recommend everybody, or all our listeners, go read. It's a fascinating. Anybody who's interested in just military history in general, or international relations in general, it's a very, very good book to read. But it's basically just this sort of cascading effect of just failure to communicate, and with all parties, and it just gets worse, and it gets worse, and it gets worse until it reaches a point to where there is no more communication anymore, and there never will be. Too much damage has been done, too much has been said, too much has been done, that either side finds unforgivable or unable to move beyond. And you get what you get. You get these, the outbreaks of violence. You get the things that people in later eras who know way less about the situation will, deem that, they'll turn it into a black and white affair of, this was genocide, or these people were victims, or these people were aggressors, or whatever. And it becomes even difficult to communicate, even over 8 centuries later, as we're still finding out. But I'm hopefully leading into, by mentioning Pedro of Aragon, I'm hoping to kind of lead us into that, because I think that's going to be a really important area to cover. But I think that's why you saw the phenomenon of even Southern French and Aragonese Catholics fighting Simone de Montfort and the Crusaders. This was something that, because of that breakdown of communication, because of that catastrophic inability to take into account all sides, and it's not any one particular person's fault, you ended up with the conflict that you had. And as you would see later on in many other devastating conflicts throughout human history.
Yeah, I got to jump on that, Rand, because that's a really good point. The Albigensian Crusade is not, it's not fought between, Orthodox Catholic French Christians and Cathars. It's fought between Orthodox Catholic in Northern French and nobles of the Languedoc, who also claim to be of sound faith. And one good example of this, okay, I don't know if you guys have read The Song of the Cathar Wars. It's one of these interesting sources we have for the Albigensian Crusade, but it's written by 2 authors. And the first author, who I believe is anonymous, he takes the perspective of the Crusaders. And he says, but he also has sympathy for the nobility of the Languedoc. For example, he's very upset by the death of Raymond Roger of Trinquevel after the capture of Carcassonne. But he does say that, they are messing up because they're refusing to cooperate with the Pope. They're harboring heretics. He does say that. But then another author picks up that source and finishes it. At some point, somebody else just finished this document. This person takes the perspective of the Southern French, of the nobles of the Languedoc, in particular, Count Raymond VI and his son. His son was Raymond VII, right? Anyway, the Counts of Toulouse, he takes their perspective, and he says that the charge that they are harboring heretics is false, and that the whole idea that, this crusade is being launched to fight heretics is a fraud. That in fact, this is just about the Northern French trying to, impose their power here. And he absolutely insists on the orthodoxy of the Counts of Toulouse, of the other nobles. And so right there, I just think it's so interesting how one of our big sources for the Albigensian Crusade is itself kind of contradictory. It contains 2 different perspectives because the 2 different parts were written by 2 different people. But one thing both sides have in common is they are both champions of orthodoxy. The Southern French poet who writes the second half of it absolutely is against the Cathar heresy. So there you go. If that doesn't sort of summarize some of the incredible issues and struggles that come up with the Albigensian Crusade, I don't know what else does. But anybody have any further comments on this? Anybody want to get into Pedro II of Aragon?
Anybody? Does that include you, Rand? I mean,
Push.
You've only mentioned him 3 times.
I know, right?
Okay, so I guess everybody's good so far. But okay, let's jump into Pedro II of Aragon. So this is another dimension to this. As we've talked about, the region of the Languedoc was more closely associated with this portion of northeastern Spain. The Kingdom of Aragon, in particular, the kings of Aragon and the counts of Barcelona had exercised a certain overlordship over a lot of these regions, like the county of Toulouse. And Pedro II, the king of Aragon at the time, in 1212, is one of the kings. We've got a couple super chats. Don't let me forget, guys. I'll read them. But okay. Anyway, so Pedro II of Aragon in 1212 is one of the kings of Spain who was involved in the Crusade of Las Navas de Tolosa. Okay, this is probably Innocent III's most successful crusade, and also the one that he was the least involved with, I think, too. But this is one of the great moments of victory in the Crusades. This is the moment that really breaks the power of the Moors in Spain, and from then on, they are on the defensive, and the initiative is on the side of the Christians. So this is a huge moment in the Crusades. Pedro II of Aragon is a hero of the Crusades, and he has been kind of back and forth with what's going on in the Albigensian Crusade. But in 1213, he decides that he's going to intervene on behalf of the Counts of Toulouse. He no longer is willing to entertain Simon of Montfort's claim, which earlier he'd been willing to. In fact, I know a lot of historians, point out his good faith in all this, but this is an interesting point here too, because now all of a sudden we've got one of the great heroes of the Crusades, Pedro II of Aragon, pitted up against Simon of Montfort, the leader of the Albigensian Crusade. So once again, this is a whole new element, and they're going to meet in battle in 1213 in one of the key battles of the Albigensian Crusade. What do you guys think about this? And before I forget, I'm going to read this super chat. Patty McGill asked if the Rosary had anything to do with the Crusade. Thanks very much, Patty. I'm not sure. We'll jump over to that after this thing about Pedro II of Aragon. And we have somebody else here. Liana says, thank you. One of the few Muslim fans of your channel. Your hard work and research is appreciated. Well, thank you, Liana. We appreciate that. We'll jump back to those. But anyway, what do you guys think about Pedro II of Aragon and this whole element here? Anybody? Or we can move on. That's fine.
I was going to jump in, but I wanted to give everyone else a chance. But no, I think where you're going is it talks to that just that cultural complexity that was in play within the Languedoc region at this period. Like you had people that that the Aragonese always had this very close relationship, especially with Toulouse, that was sort of cross-Pyrenees relationship, if you could call it. And I really do think that Pedro, I'm always sort of on the fence about him as far as his motives in getting involved. I think perhaps it was a little bit of opportunism. Perhaps it was a little bit of just familiarity, cultural familiarity with the Toulouseois. I don't. I mean,
I think there's no question he had political motives here.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. There's no question that there wasn't a little bit of political and personal ambition involved in this.
I mean, it's like he's the king of Aragon. He's exercised a certain overlordship here. Does he want to see northern France and thereby, the king of France?
Yeah. Does he really want to see? Does he really want to see Louis VIII on his doorstep? Or would he rather have a very culturally distinct, ethnically distinct,
still Philip II at this point,
politically independent buffer state in between him and the rest of France. You know,
but it kind of comes back to this whole thing of these temporal and spiritual motives are kind of blended here. You know, I mean, I don't think Pedro II was Pedro II. Part of this too. There's another issue here. He was the Kingdom of Aragon was traditionally a vassal state to the papacy, so this brought up a whole issue of embarrassment and problems for Pope Innocent. Pedro ends up dying in battle, and his son James of Aragon had actually been in Simon of Montfort's custody as part of an earlier agreement, and the Pope ends up taking custody of the heir to the throne of Aragon. But
yeah.
But yeah, it's craziness, and there's like a blending of spiritual and political motives for somebody like Pedro II of Aragon and for Simon of Montfort. I mean, and I'm sure you were talking about that, Paul, earlier, but
yep.
Anyway, but it's really hard to know. Like, I almost think sometimes if we talk about, well, where does the political angle begin and the spiritual angle end? I think that's almost erroneous. But at the same time, you have to kind of wonder sometimes what was really going on in these people's minds. Like, on some level, because there were instances where the nobility of the Languedoc kind of tried to, or sort of made a show of kind of like, okay, well, we'll go along with it, and then the Crusaders kind of still pushed on and kind of still, still said, well, we're going to take you out anyway, So you kind of have to wonder.
Yeah. And that's where, and I think honestly, again, that's one of the key things to understand in this period is that, not like we talked about with the faith, how we sort of talked about how there was no distinction between the temporal and the spiritual within the mind of the medieval Christian. At the same time, there was also a very the ideas of feudal lordship and the rights inherent to that the nobility of the time saw themselves as existing inherently within them and within their title. Those two were very, very real concepts. This isn't Europe of the late 18th century where feudal titles are just sort of the stuff of fluff and feathers and ultimately hollow and meaningless. No, at that time, like, it actually meant something. If you had a feudal tie, if you were a nobleman in the early 1200s and you had a feudal tie, whether by marriage or by blood, to a certain region, that was a very real, tangible thing, and it had very real social, political, and military consequences for the society of that time. And so it becomes a little easier to understand why people would apparently act in ways that seem contradictory.
Hard for us to understand, yeah.
Yeah, because that's
a really good point, Rand.
And because Pedro of Aragon is going to look at a region that he's had a very close, that his family has had very close relationships with for over 2 centuries at least. And he's going to see it now under threat from a very culturally distinct entity that is not friendly to him and is not friendly to his family's interest and does not respect the blood ties that they've shared in their past. And so to him, that's a very real threat. That's an existential threat. That's shaking up the whole social order that he's ever known and that his family has ever known for generations. And that could have very grave effects on his future generations. It was all very tied to blood and to family and to the very tangible realities that accompanied those. And that may help people understand sort of where these people were coming from when, yes, they professed the Catholic faith, some of them even fought and bled for it heroically, like Pedro of Aragon at Navas de Tolosa. But it still competed with the hard, tangible realities of what they also knew in terms of family, in terms of blood ties, in terms of feudal lordships and feudal obligations and whatnot. There's way too many other things going on to narrow it down or to water it down to this sort of, very black and white, oh, well, these people wanted to be Catholic and these people didn't. It's like, no, it's way more complex than that. And as we've discussed, it just becomes painfully apparent in the story of the Albigensian Crusade.
Yeah, I think that's one thing that can be hard for people to get now. Like, you look at somebody like Pedro II of Aragon, and sort of the modern mind thinks, oh, well, he was just kind of trying to see what he could gain from there. I mean, just kind of this sort of cynical way of looking at it. But I think what you're saying, Rain, is, I mean, there's a spiritual component almost to the political motivations behind this stuff. Like, yeah, this region, it's like Pedro II of Aragon's forefathers had played a role as in this region, and that was the kind of thing that's going to stir the emotions of the nobility. These are the types of emotions that we just really can't relate to, I think, in the modern world. It's kind of the type of honor that kind of was lay at the heart of the way these guys thought. I mean, anyway. So, okay, we're kind of coming to the end of this thing here, and I guess really the last question here, I think sort of the big question of the Albigensian Crusade is, was this direction a legitimate direction for crusading? Like, was Pope Innocent III taking the Crusades in a direction that was good for, or maybe even consistent with the kind of like core principles of it? And the next thing is, I think, did the actual conduct in the Albigensian Crusade delegitimize that, even if that was the case? Like, the brutality and the nastiness of the war, did that delegitimize it? But anyway, I don't want to be too heavy with my questions, even though I was. But do you guys have any final thoughts about that particular big question here?
Yeah, so I think that the brutality did definitely delegitimize the underlying purpose of the crusade. I think that in theory, the idea of a crusade to establish stability, to allow the theological minds of the mendicant orders to do their work, that it was good in theory, but because it failed to understand that the people you are fighting against are precisely the people you are trying to convert, it undermined the overall purpose of the Crusades. I mean, for example, when we're talking about Christian pilgrims in the East, we're not just talking, in terms of going to Jerusalem. We're not just talking about pilgrims from France, from Spain, from England, from Italy, from Germany. We're talking about Greek pilgrims too. You know, these were when the Crusaders took Jerusalem in the first Crusade. And they marched east to protect these pilgrims. They were protecting Eastern Orthodox Christians who were excommunicates. I mean, from 1054 on, these people were excommunicates. So they were protecting them as well, just as much as they were protecting their fellow countrymen that were making these journeys. But beyond that, when you get to fighting in the home front, fighting in southern France, you start to run into the very real problem of you are fighting against the people that you want to convert. And I don't think that that was a good mix. I don't think that that was true to the original intention of the crusade, which was a very defensive maneuver. So it was taking a problem and using the wrong tool for the wrong job. The saying goes that when all you have is a hammer, every problem is a nail. That was what it had. That's what we see right here is the incorrect tool being applied to the job. And in fact, the Crusades don't wipe out the Cathars. They, even though the whole thing is up in the air. Um, you know, the fact is, even though the Crusaders win the war, uh, the crusade itself that goes on for 20 years doesn't end the heresy. It goes on for quite a while after that. uh, you have remnants of Catharism in the area for quite some time, and it does take the Mendicant orders. The Dominicans, particularly, are the ones that wind up wiping out this threat, and they were the ones to lead that charge. They were the right tool. Um, and even in the unstable, uh, you know, Cathar-run world of Raymond VI of Toulouse, they were still the right tool for the right job. And so I think that this was really just a miscalculation, and it was an improper application of forces.
I'm at the risk of being the contrarian opinion, and
Go for it.
I love you, Paul. I love you to death. This is nothing personal, but I would say this, from just a purely historical perspective. I do believe that it took both efforts. I honestly, I feel like with the social and political and cultural structure that existed in the Languedoc at that time, had it just been the Mendicant orders, it would not have been enough. That there did need to be a smashing apart or a breaking apart of the social conditions that allowed Catharism to exist in the first place. And that was essentially the leadership of southern France at that time. That was the leadership of the Languedoc. And the only way that was going to be removed or to be undone was via violent force. I would, at the risk of sounding like a cynic, or even worse, God forbid, a nihilist. But I have, throughout my historical studies, come of the opinion that if you want to really change history, I mean like really fundamentally change history, you're gonna have to be ready to kill a lot of people on a lot of battlefields. It just seems to be the one and the most the deepest reaching vehicle for fundamental historical for a fundamental change in the direction of history. And after the Albigensian Crusade, for better or for worse, the Cathars were broken. They were a broken force. They were never going to be what they had started to become before it happened. And again, I'm not trying to legitimize the method. I'm not trying to say that was maybe the best method that could have been used. But it did serve a purpose, and it did actually work in a way. I would also argue that, yes, while it was the Mendicants who proved the most effective at engaging in the spiritual dialogue, the Mendicants could not have been as successful as they were had they not had the full backing of the state apparatus of King St. Louis IX behind them. That was what really rooted out the Cathar heresy at its core. Was the ceaseless efforts of King St. Louis IX and his courts and his Inquisition courts that went in and backed up the Mendicant orders and gave them the force of law. That sort of social and that sort of socio-political force behind them, to be able to truly confront the heresy and root it out. And it took the better part of his reign. I mean, King St. Louis IX had one of the longer reigns of the kings of France, and it took, I would say, probably the vast majority of it. But I don't think those conditions would have existed had not the Cathars and the leadership that had allowed them to exist in the first place, whether they agreed with them or not, been smashed apart by the violence of the Albigensian Crusade. So that, I guess if I had a thesis, it was that violence had a role to play, and it was not a useless one. And maybe that's a hard thing to sell in this day and age, but there it is. So
Yeah, and that's and I think if anybody should take anything away from this, it should be that, there is a very wonderful diversity of outlooks, even here at Real Crusades history.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, guys. Or both of your points are good. And that's the thing. You guys are both touching on very legitimate perspectives on this thing, and I think I've really looked at the Albigensian Crusade a lot of different ways. I think that Rand makes a really good point when he says that probably the change that took place, this conquest was required. And one thing we do need to keep in mind is that this is also about the political instability, if you will, in the Languedoc. Like there was kind of a breakdown of law and order to some extent, and another issue that went along with the Cathar heresy was kind of these roving bands of mercenaries and stuff that were causing violence and upheaval for the local people. Now that at the same time that the monarchies in Latin Christendom are becoming more centralized, governments becoming more formalized, and the Languedoc seems to be kind of left behind in that. The Languedoc is kind of almost a relic from the early 12th century, kind of this age of the troubadours, a time when there was less centralization. And I mean, the Albigensian Crusade, that it's as much about that as it is about this Cathar heresy, as about kind of somebody was going to kind of bring that region into the present era, whether it was the King of France or the King of Aragon or whatever power. So yeah. Now, the one thing I do think that absolutely, we have to look at it and say this was a horribly negative thing is the excesses of violence. And for the standards of the time, a lot of the stuff that happened in the Albigensian Crusade was extreme. Absolutely. I think a lot of people make the mistake. They think, oh, well, this was just, medieval warfare, par for the course. No, I mean, stuff was happening that was shocking people throughout Christendom, and especially early on, before, I do think before Simone of Montfort gets involved, it's actually almost worse. I mean, the stuff the period where the Abbot of Citeaux is running things, and the siege of Bezier. The siege of Bezier seems to be pretty poorly run in a lot of ways. I mean, I think that's exactly why this kind of out of control massacre happened, is because the Abbot of Citeaux was not really competent to run this thing. I mean, he's a churchman. He's not a military commander. A good military commander makes sure that what he wants to happen happens. Like Baldwin I of Jerusalem, he had people hanged if they started sacking a city that he didn't want sacked. And if you're going to sack a city, that's one thing, but if you're going to give terms to the population, that's another thing. And I think that all the indication is that the abbot, despite that famous quote supposedly that he said, "Kill them all, God will know his own," it sounds to me more like he just didn't know what was going on, And by the time he found out the massacre, which was more limited in scope than I think is often presented, had already happened. So anyway, it's just it's interesting, and I don't really have a final opinion on the Albigensian Crusade, honestly. I do think that, okay, I think what the Pope envisioned happening probably was pretty reasonable. He thought he was trying to get control of the situation, and he wanted, honorable, holy warriors to go in there and take control and make, the country stable for the church, or make the region stable for the church. That's not what happened exactly. I think that if, especially if some of these events earlier on had gone more smoothly, if there had been better behavior, more magnanimous behavior, then maybe the whole thing wouldn't have turned into such a nightmare like it did. But, anyway, I absolutely agree with Paul that there is a clear misapplication of force throughout this thing. And that leads to very bad consequences. And I think, 100 years from now, the Pope is going to be in a very different position than he's in at this time. He's going to be more marginalized in Christendom, more under the thumb of the French king. So one wonders, was Pope Innocent III kind of putting the church in a position of biting off a bit more than it could chew? One of the things that kind of elevated the popes at the start of the age of the Crusades, the popes were kind of on the run. They were kind of these figures that were just kind of rallying the fighting men of Christendom to something higher, as opposed to once we get into the 13th century and it's like the popes are now at the top of the heap and they're kind of knee deep in the politics themselves, rather than kind of this voice of this voice of God kind of crying out to them saying, put aside your own internal squabbles and go fight the enemies of Christendom. Go fight the Saracens in the East and in Spain. And
sort of the wandering wizard,
well, it's like almost like Christ himself. Christ was not a great political leader. He was, but there was such power in the early apostles and all that stuff. And I think that kind of the popes, kind of when they were engaged in this desperate struggle with the German emperors, and they were kind of rallying Christendom to this great cause, there was a power in that, and and a result of that was the papacy's political position was more secure. Right. I mean, that's, I think the Crusades played a certain role in, making the Gregorian reforms successful. But anyway, so those are some thoughts from me. Anything else from anybody? Scott, Rand, Paul?
Well, I guess the only thing I can think of is, what would have happened in alternative history if nothing had happened, if there hadn't been an Albigensian Crusade, if things would have just gone along the way they were. Like,
are you saying would Catharism? That's an interesting question. Would Catharism have even really?
Yeah, would it ever have really taken off, or was it just something that was doomed to fail? Would it have collapsed under its own deficiencies or its own weaknesses or whatever? That's the only thing I can. I mean, you guys are really, honestly, that's the only thing I can think of.
Yeah, honestly, I don't think we'll ever know the answer to that question. I don't think history got to ever really see what it may have turned into. I think it was. Honestly, I think the experience of Catharism as a whole collectively was sort of nipped in the bud, just via the historical circumstances. Although you could make the connection, and I think it's a worthwhile one, that and this may not have had anything to do with Catharism in particular, but I do find it interesting that once the Protestant Reformation and especially Calvinism started making inroads into France, the most enthusiastic regions of France that embraced Calvinism was the Languedoc. And And I think it's interesting to note that Calvinism and Calvinist Protestantism and Catharism sort of shared, at least they were sort of ideological cousins, in the fact that they both borrowed very heavily from a very dualistic worldview. And it was Calvinism was sort of yet another manifestation of that ghost of Gnosticism that has sort of haunted Christianity since its beginning. I do feel, I mean, you saw elements of Huguenot French Calvinism clear into the 18th century in France. So I think it's worth exploring that perhaps there were some conditions laid down there that maybe made orthodoxy set orthodoxy on very shaky ground in southern France. So who knows? I think ultimately, I'm not sure if we'll ever know what would have happened had the Albigensian Crusade never occurred.
One thing that might have occurred is that I think that region was headed for some type of conquest action anyway. And the reality is that the rulers of Christendom at this time, they didn't tolerate heresy. I mean, if the Pope had never done anything, I mean, if the King of France had ended up ruling that area anyway, he might have put down the Cathars with a lot more brutality than the church ever did. That's one thing people don't realize. The Inquisition was kind of a moderating force in terms of how heretics were treated.
It was, in fact, the inquisitorial roles in other books, and I don't want to delve too heavily into it, show that realistically speaking, when heretics were outed and they confessed and everything like that, the Inquisition basically said, no, guys, these people are exempt from the civil authority because they have repented of their sins and they have been forgiven by the church. You cannot touch them anymore.
Yep. In fact, there were several cases of confiscated property having to be literally being ordered by the church, by the Inquisition, to be restored to formerly heretic families that had repented.
Yep.
And you literally had inquisitorial courts making inquests and then going to the kings of France or to various lords and saying, these people deserve restitution.
Yep.
They don't deserve to have their patrimony taken away from them. Yeah. And it caused a lot of issues because, these were people who, these were lands, these were properties, these were, very valuable assets that all of a sudden had to be given back to who they'd been taken from.
Yep.
And that happened all the time. And that was one of the reasons why King St. Louis IX had the reputation that he did in southern France, was because he was wholeheartedly behind that concept. He wholeheartedly supported giving due. Once the church told him that somebody deserved restitution, that they didn't deserve to have their property confiscated, he was absolutely 100% behind giving that, ensuring that restitution occurred, even if it meant sort of having to lean on an aristocrat or two to ensure that happened.
Yeah. All right. Well, I'm probably gonna have to call it a night for us now, guys. But we've gotten to some really good points here, I think, with this whole thing, and this conversation did not disappoint me. It was as fascinating as I thought it would be. I think one thing we can agree on is the way that this thing is discussed in popular culture is just mostly garbage. I mean, it really is.
I mean, that sort of goes without saying with anything in popular culture, but that's just us.
It does. I mean, yeah. People have these very, sort of self-righteous opinions about the Albigensian Crusade that are based in total nonsense. And it's
honk honk, everybody, honk honk.
Yeah.
Okay, well, guys, this has been fun. And I'm really glad I was able to hear Paul. At some point, I was able to start hearing you, so I'm really glad of that. So.
Oh yeah.
Okay. I'm going to say goodnight to each of you individually. I like doing it that way. Rand, good night, my friend.
Take care.
Scott, thanks for being here.
Thank you, Stephen. Enjoyed it.
Excellent.
And good to hear from you and Paul as well. Rand and Paul as well.
You too, Scott.
Yep.
Yeah, and Paul, it was lots of fun having you on. Thanks for coming.
Absolutely. Anytime.
Okay. All right, everybody. Well, and thanks to everybody in the chat. We certainly appreciate everybody hanging out with us. We'll talk to you soon. Good night.
Good night.
Dave's
Night.